lot of contemporary philosophers and scientists who tend more in an atheist or agnostic direction are really allergic to this aspect of Whitehead's thought. There are some Whiteheadians who try to have Whitehead without God, and I encourage any innovations upon Whitehead's thought, though I think Whitehead himself was led to develop a concept of God, and we should be clear that he really was engaging in metaphysics in a dispassionate way. He wasn't really guided by religious feeling or emotion in articulating this concept of God, though it can be a source of religious worship, but that's not what was driving Whitehead. And really, he says that he was driven to his concept of God really through reflections on certain mathematical and logical problems. He talks about Aristotle's theology and Aristotle's conception of the divine as an unmoved mover, which in the context of Aristotle's cosmology, this is solving a problem. What's the source of motion, and Whitehead says, well, look, we have a different physics now, and so Aristotle's solution isn't relevant to us anymore. But he thinks there's an analogous problem in the contemporary context of quantum physics, and that is, given that there seems to be this infinite plenum of possibility, the quantum void, out of which the entire cosmos has emerged. How is it that we can explain the emergence of something definite or actual out of this plenum of possibility? God serves the function of limiting the pure possibility such that something actual can arise, right? So Whitehead's God, he says, it's the principle of limitation, or it's the principle of concretion, he says also. And so, in Whitehead's cosmology, his ultimate principle is creativity, which you could say is akin to this pure possibility. But God is the first creature of creativity that conditions that creativity. And so by conditioning that creativity, something definite, something finite, something actual is allowed to emerge. And for Whitehead, if God is the first creature, every subsequent creature or actual occasion of experience is inheriting God's initial aim. And Whitehead describes the initial aim as this, as God's eternal valuation or envisagement of the realm of infinite possibilities. And this, you could say that this is heaven, God's initial valuation of the realm of possibility. And it's an ideal that all subsequent occasions of experience have sort of, that their experience is seeded with. God's initial aim doesn't determine what every other creature decides to do with its experience, but it's like luring them toward what would be most beautiful given their finite condition and in location and space and time. So, I'm describing what Whitehead calls the primordial nature of God, the conditioner of possibility, that provides an initial aim or a lure or some eros that's trying to goad all the other creatures of the universe toward beauty. But Whitehead also has this other pole of the divine nature that he calls the consequent nature. And so if the primordial nature is God sort of alone and indeed transcendent in some respects, the consequent nature is I think where Whitehead's real innovation and theologically comes in. This is a God who is not unmoved by the creation, but that is the fellow sufferer who feels with the world, who feels with each creature all all of the joy and the suffering that transpires in space and time, and somehow integrates all of that diversity of experience with the initial aim, with the ideal. Now, process theologians, beginning with Charles Hartshorne, who studied with Whitehead, have been struggling to fit these two, you could say, two gods together. And Whitehead himself doesn't seem to have been totally satisfied, because I think you can kind of see how the consequent nature of God has more religious connotation to it than the primordial nature, which is more of a cosmological principle. And so sometimes I say the primordial nature of God is it's the condition that makes cosmology, it's the condition that made the cosmos possible. And so it has more of a metaphysical function, whereas the consequent nature is more anthropological. It's an attempt to respond to our human need for some source of consolation, some source of atonement for the wreckage of history. And so, is it two gods? Is it two sides of one God? Whatever it is, it's a God in process, and it's I think a worthy image of the divine, to try to work with and to bring into our religious communities, because I think it does have implications for how we are with each other, how we are with the earth, how we conceive of the ultimate destiny of the earth and of our species and of life as such. And so it's really what has kept Whitehead's work in print for decades was this theology taken up by mostly American theologians. And so it's only more recently that Whitehead's getting attention in other disciplines.
Right. Philosophers are gradually being like, oh, right, we should be reading this guy. So yeah, it's funny that how theologians were like, we like this a lot. And then a little bit, eco-theology, process theology, feminist theologians have gotten into it. And it's interesting to know that he wasn't really motivated by religion. He was really just applying this as he's like, I'm just doing speculative metaphysics, and here's where God fits into these problems that contemporary science is opening up for us. Do you know if he had much of a religious background?
Well, I mean, he certainly has the background. I mean,
yeah, so he's informed, at least in his imagination, of kind of a Christian sense of God. Because some of this sounds like the whole problem of like Jesus, right? That Jesus is kind of consequent, more anthropological. Right. And people are like, that's two gods. And so many people are like, you guys are ruining the monotheism thing. You can't do that. And they're like, no, it's like there's Father, Son, you got Spirit. Like, they're just adding more things all the time. And that's just an inherent paradox in Christianity. And so it's interesting to see how Whitehead's reworking that, but the transcendent God is no longer omnipotent, and the immanent God is inside of everything. It didn't just get locked up into the body of Jesus Christ. So we can say there's some God in an animal, and in plants, and in the whole cosmos. So I guess, would this be where the world soul fits in?
Yeah,
the whole world has its own kind of soul. Is the soul like the spark of the divine in the cosmos? What is that? Where's the world soul at?
Yeah, well, if God is the principle of concretion, there's also a sense in which if the universe itself has any internal connectivity, if the universe itself hangs together as a whole, then it would be ensouled in some way. And this is the role that the divine would play in Whitehead's universe, as the concrete togetherness of all beings and all creatures in some cosmic body of Christ, if you want. And so and so this is why God, or what Isabel Stengers calls the divine function in Whitehead's scheme, has scientific significance, because where does the unity of nature come from? Kant thought a lot about this and said, oh, well, it's a transcendental, presupposition of science. We don't go out and discover it, we presuppose it. And for more empirically minded or materialist scientists, I'm not sure what sort of arguments they'd be able to come up with. You kind of have to presuppose unity in order for law to even make sense,
Right.
um, or the universality of law to make sense. And so, you know, Whitehead makes these controversial claims about the historical emergence of science out of um, European Christian theology, uh, you know, for this reason, among others. And so, yeah, the world soul is not a term that Whitehead uses often. He does mention it a bit in Adventures of Ideas, and so I'm, you know, going beyond really his explicit statements in naming the divine presence in the world in this way. But you know, he's, I think, accurately described as a panentheist in the sense that, you know, in some ways God is transcends the world in the sense that God is before, um, logically before other creatures, even though God is also a creature, and God is also immanent because there is this um, divine aim immanent in the experience of all creatures, and also this consequent nature of God that's sort of um, growing with the world as it evolves. And so sometimes I joke and say Whitehead's a pan-gen theist, with gen signaling like Genesis or sort of ongoing creation, whereas panentheist might give the impression that it's a sort of static creation.
Right, right. No, that's a good one. Yeah, that everything is generating God and God is generating everything.
Yeah.
So yeah, the ongoing Genesis reminds me very much of Catherine Keller's work in Face of the Deep. It's definitely this continual creation.
Yep.
And it's so weird to think of God as a creature, and so God's not primary. That's such a strange kind of thing. Since it's like, well, then what's this creativity stuff? Creativity is itself not God, so we don't worship creativity, but we
Right.
worship God.
Yeah. Well, creativity is it's like Whitehead's replacement for the Aristotelian matter.
Right.
It's like everything is made of it, you know. It's so ultimate and so generic that you can't even really describe it. There's nothing that isn't it,
Right.
including God.
Right.
But you know, God does have some special status, just as the primordial creature.
Yeah.
Um, but Whitehead does insist that, you know, we shouldn't be in a situation where we're constantly having to pay metaphysical compliments to the divine. He wants to bring God down off the pedestal that most religiously motivated theological reflection has put God on. I almost used the male pronoun. Whitehead uses it, but I think we don't need to do that. Um, but yeah, so, you know, God is with the world, right, and not above it. Whitehead has very little patience for the image of God. He says it's a residue of barbaric imagination that makes God in the image of Caesar or some dictator, that, you know, is lording over reality and somehow is both all powerful and gets really mad when creation doesn't
Yeah.
behave as it should. And it's not clear why creatures should have any freedom to begin with if God's really all powerful. So,
Yeah, right. That's such an old doctrine, that God's omnipotent, and lots of people have showed that has provided justification for all kinds of terrible politics and ethics. It's like, well, if God relates to creation by dominating, then that's how we should relate to things. And so then everything is just about power always flows down.
mm,
And it isn't this kind of, like you said, God is with the world. Well, what if power was this kind of mutual empowerment? There's some reciprocity there. God suffers with us. That means that if we're supposed to like mirror God in our life, then we should never have power flowing down. And so, I mean, the implications for this. I mean, how would we have like a capitalist economic system that's all about exploitation? And so, I mean, the implications are really profound for transforming our current way of life because we have domination everywhere, whether it's capitalist exploitation of resources and the poor, or racist and sexist hierarchies. Like all of those things kind of come toppling down Once you say, no, God doesn't work top down, God works with, you go, oh, then all power needs to be reconstrued as power with and power within instead of power over.
Right.
So I think, I don't know, I hope that as analytic philosophers are getting into Whitehead, that they're not cutting God out too much, because that's some of the most profound implications, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in Adventures of Ideas, Whitehead has a condensed reading of the last few thousand years of European history, and sees this gradual transition away from coercion as the dominant mode of
Right.
power toward persuasion. And so I see this as it's an invitation to not run away from power as if power is bad and like no power, but no, engage the power of persuasion as a different form of organizing societies. And, for Whitehead, to the extent that a civilized so-called society engages in coercive operations, that's a failure of civilization. If civilization is to have some positive, if we're to give some positive account of civilization, for Whitehead, it would be this gradual movement toward persuasion as the predominant mode of engagement. And he had his critiques of capitalism. He wasn't a Marxist; he was a liberal in the classical sense, but he certainly saw the plight of workers and wanted some major reforms there, not revolution, but reform.
Right.
But he gave talks to the business school at Harvard, and he, in Adventures of Ideas, also talks a lot about commerce and trade. And he saw something trying to happen in the development of commerce in the history of the human species that was more about persuasion than coercion. Obviously there's a lot of work that remains to be done to fully shift a capitalist economy in that direction. But I think, Whitehead presents, like, his political philosophy is pretty much going to upset both extremes, on the left and the right. But he's not a moderate either. He's not a centrist. He's quite radical in other ways. And so, as someone who does tend to lean more to the left, in reading his statements on political philosophy and economics and business and stuff, it's been, I'll admit, like a challenge for me to really integrate what he's trying to say. But keeping in mind this movement towards persuasion and the image of the divine that inspires this movement, as you're saying, Whitehead says the power of God is the worship that God inspires, which I read as Whitehead suggesting, like, God needs our help, right? The nature of the divine is not finished. God wants to be a certain way, but we have to participate in realizing that sort of divine nature. And it's up for grabs at this point.